Dear information professionals and practitioners, my name is Vladimir Videnovic, and it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome you to the Information Awareness Month 2020 on behalf of the Institute for Information Management and other organizations that participate in making of the IAM 2020. Before we start today's proceedings, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country around Australia and recognize their continuing connection with land, waters, and culture, and also to pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, I would like to quickly revisit some of the points that will enable a smooth flow of this webinar. I encourage all participants to ask questions using the Zoom Q&A option, which is in the Zoom control panel on the bottom of your screen. To ask your questions, please start by stating your name and, if applicable, for which panelist is your question. Now, before I hand over to the webinar moderators, I would like to ask you to respond to our first two polling questions that should be on your screen now. And it is indeed my pleasure to introduce you to the moderators of today's webinar, Adrian Cunningham and David Williams, starting with Adrian.
Okay, thank you very much, Vlad, and welcome to participants from all across Australia and New Zealand. One of the advantages of being in lockdown is that the Information Awareness Month launch can now be a virtual event and involve a much bigger audience than would normally be the case. So welcome to everyone, and thank you for taking advantage of the technology to be with us. So it's my honour and pleasure this morning to introduce our four highly distinguished panellists. We have David Fricker, who's the Director General of the National Archives of Australia, and also for some years has been President of the International Council on Archives. Our second panellist is Elizabeth Tydd, who's the New South Wales Information Commissioner. Our third panellist is Timothy Graham, who's a Senior Lecturer in Digital Media and Communications at the Queensland University of Technology. And our fourth panellist is Kathryn Dan, and Kathryn is here this morning representing Blue Shield Australia. Now, for those of you who might not be familiar with Blue Shield is an international non-government organisation that aims to protect cultural heritage that is threatened by armed conflict or disasters. And Kathryn is a member of the Australian Blue Shield Committee. Her day job is as the archivist at the Australian National University. So the way things are going to work over the coming hour is I'll be facilitating the first half of the webinar, and I have a couple of pre-agreed questions that I'll be putting to the four panellists. Meanwhile, you'll all be asking your questions using the Q&A functionality on the platform, and my fellow moderator Dave will be checking out those questions and making a selection of them to put to the panel in the second half of the seminar, when at about 11:30 I'll be handing over to him. So, so without further ado, I'll now put the first question to the panel members, and it's a sort of a general statement kind of opening question. I'd like to hear from each of the four of you about your personal views and perspectives on accessing and using the right information in critical situations in light of recent events, and what we as information management professionals can do to enable good outcomes in these kinds of situations. So David Fricker, if I can hand over to you for the first answer.
Well, thank you very much, Adrian. And look, as I'm talking to you today from Ngunnawal country in Canberra, can I first start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which I'm talking to you today, the Ngunnawal people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. And in the language of the Ngunnawal, I say Gurul Marambang. That means good day. Look, Thanks, Adrian, for that opening question. I guess the main thing for me, and particularly in our role here at the National Archives of Australia, is to look at what's happening around the events affecting Australia today and the world. The COVID-19 is certainly a turning point in world history and certainly a turning point in Australia's history. And where we sit in the National Archives of Australia in the federal government sphere, what we're seeing is that a rapid pace of decisions being made at the federal government level, indeed through the National Cabinet, but at the federal government level, which are major interventions into almost every aspect of government activity. So whether it's the economy, examining the Australian economy, the supply chains that feed the economy, how the economy works to deliver prosperity across the community of Australia, whether it's health, the delivery of health policy, health programs, the development of therapeutic drugs, of medicines, and of course the vaccine, whether it's culture and the way that Australians are connecting with one another and living our normal Australian lives. These things are all being profoundly affected by the very rapid pace of change being made by the government every hour of every day. And all of us across government are really involved in the cut and thrust of this very rapid pace of activity. And when you're in the middle of something like this, it's very difficult sometimes to see the whole picture, to really completely understand what is going on and to develop a very deep understanding of cause and effect. To do that, you need a bit of time and distance. You need a bit of time to let the crisis run its course and a bit of distance to allow you to, if you like, step back from the center of activity to really appreciate the whole. And once you've got that appreciation, of course, then you can start making evaluations and assessments. Where are the vulnerabilities in Australia? Where are the successes that we've had? What are the achievements that we've made? And what are the lessons we learn so that we can face the next pandemic in much better shape? And this is what the National Archives is for. It's to make sure that while we are in the middle of the cut and thrust of this frantic activity, we can preserve the records, we can preserve the evidence, the memory of what is going on, what decisions are being made, what activities are being undertaken, and ultimately what is the effect, the success or otherwise of those activities, so that we have that evidentiary trail, we have that body of records about what we've just done, which then becomes a national asset upon which we can build our road to recovery out of the COVID-19, and indeed upon which Australia and humanity can prepare itself in a much better form for the next pandemic.
That's great. Thank you very much, David. Can I now ask Elizabeth to answer the question? Thanks, Elizabeth.
Features that have enabled that have been digital government and the application of data, increasing partnerships and outsourcing arrangements, and to David's point, new models of government, and they transcend the traditional agency silo that we operated in previously. Now, they took the form of things like task forces now, but look at what we currently have in terms of a national cabinet. So at all levels, the way government has done business, the way it's made decisions has changed. In my view, never before has there been such a need to focus on transparency and accountability than there is now. And that highlights the role of information management professionals. We have to look at checks and balances that will apply. We have to look at how public engagement is fostered during this time and how we might ultimately readjust. Information is the foundation of both the engagement, but also our current operating environment and the future. And that information must be considered in light of the public's interest. The app, the tracking app, really brings to the fore those issues that compete between individual rights and collective good or the ultimate public interest. Now, that tracking app, I guess, is probably the quintessential example of those three changes that I talked about, digital government and data application that change the way government makes decisions, increasing partnerships and outsourcing arrangement. Where does this data come from? And then novel modes of working. So the proposal for the tracing app that works, tracking app I should say, that works between the Commonwealth and the states. New models of government delivery, but why? It's being brought into reality to address something that is, as David said, in our lifetime unprecedented. I first started looking at some numbers in preparation for my presentation and discussion with you today on Monday, and I looked at the effect of COVID having impacted, according to World Odometer, 3 million people. I updated it this morning. It's 3.3 million people now in a couple of days. There were, at that time, close to 220,000 deaths globally. Now there's over 230,000 deaths globally. So it's essential to have the right information, to have transparency of information, to have it managed to ensure it's accurate. But that information is also fundamental to us enlivening and upholding our democratic values. So how do we do that in this digital era? Things like source codes, things like test suites, they're all new dimensions of sound information management practices.
Great. Okay, thank you very much, Elizabeth. Tim, can I switch over to you now?
Yes, of course. Yeah. So, well, first of all, thank you, Adrian, and everyone in IAM for the opportunity to participate on the panel. I suppose just building on what Elizabeth and David had mentioned before, one area that I look at specifically is social media and misinformation. And I think echoing some of the important points that Elizabeth has made, I think one of the key goals during times like this, crisis periods, is providing and sharing quality and reliable information about misinformation. So I think that governments around the world and organizations are struggling to get quality information about what's happening. And I think that the discussions that are taking place on social media are informing policy, they're informing foreign relations, and I'm not so sure that this is such a good thing at the moment. So a case in point is the inquiry, called for an inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus, and the Prime Minister has come under fire from Beijing about some of these calls to investigate this and calls for transparency. And for a researcher like me who studies misinformation and the public discussion about these kinds of issues, the world is essentially on fire at the moment, and there's a very big lack of quality, reliable information about what is true, what we know, and where does it come from for governments and organizations to act on. So I think, I mean, probably the most important thing at the moment, and again, this echoes some of what Elizabeth and David had talked about, is being able to provide clear and accessible data that governments can use, being able to put it in a format that can be readily processed and accessed across all of government, and in a way that is also consonant with privacy and ethical considerations. I think that we're often in the dark when we're looking at this. I think that there's many different hands that don't know what the other hands are doing, so to speak, for a multi-handed apparatus like the state. And so I really think that having well-organized single points of truth, especially around very sensitive global discussions such as the origins of the coronavirus, I think that there is a very important role for information management professionals and agencies to try and somehow figure out a way to navigate all of the various complexities so that we can provide good intel at critical times, so that we don't we don't go down dark paths in terms of our foreign relations with other states.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Tim. Kathryn, can I switch over to you now?
Okay, thanks, Adrian, and thank you everyone who's been involved in organising, and my fellow panellists. It's great to speak to you. I'm also on Ngunnawal land this morning, so I acknowledge their elders. Look, it's very interesting what people have been saying, and chimes in with many of the thoughts that that I'd had, particularly from a Blue Shield Australia perspective. Many of those thoughts about sharing information or the strength of information networks when we are in a crisis situation and after a crisis situation to respond. So importance of information networks and actually learning from what's happening. So as well as being in the midst of the COVID-19 health crisis, we've also over the last 6 months or so experienced some extreme events such as bushfires, smoke, hail, storm damage, just to name a few. And with all of those things, there have been challenges for our archives, our records, our documentary heritage, and that's where Blue Shield Australia is coming from, a perspective of building networks and preparedness for protecting cultural heritage. In our country, it tends to be the natural disasters, but you know, our current pandemic is another aspect. So we work in preparedness and planning, in response resources where the information networks are really important, and in recovery. And I was reflecting on our current situation and thinking some of the challenges of the last 6 months have been about information. They've been about maintaining really good, clear coordination and exchange of information within our networks when we're facing simultaneous situations. So we have bushfires across most of the country at the same time, and lots of organisations looking at how they were going to respond. So the strength of information exchange before the crisis, I think, is one of the things that I think about. We also focus on disaster preparedness, but there are some things that we would not have accounted for in our disaster planning. So smoke, I think, was new for many organisations, and there's now research on how does smoke impact on cultural collections, because that wasn't something that we had looked at much before. There's kind of conservator research on the impact of hand sanitizer on paper records, because we'd not thought about this before. So I bet if you looked at the disaster plans for most archives and records organisations, they would not have included a health crisis and the sorts of impacts that that can have on services and so on. So that's another thing where I think we need to take the information we have now and learn from it. And I guess there was so it's our networks, it's having the information that and reflecting on it so we can learn. And I guess the other thing that I'd like to reflect on is the psychological impact of multiple situations, and the need for our people who are doing this information management work to be able to respond. So to have clear information to be able to do their work and also respond and be able to be resilient in their response. So I think archives, records, information management organisations have a really important role to play in the resilience of community. And I think that will be important through all of these crises. And I guess that goes to some of the things that David was saying about the importance of the memory of this moment, and that we are actually responsible for this point of time in history. So I guess information is critical for our networks, our ability to respond, our ability to learn, and our ability to be resilient.
Right, thank you, everyone. So this issue of misinformation, I think, is quite a challenging one for us. I mean, misinformation has been around for as long as humanity, of course. Human beings love spreading false rumours, and they always have done. The issue we have nowadays is that the technologies and opportunities and platforms for that to proliferate are much greater, and consequently the dangers are much greater. But at the same time, the opportunities that things like social media provide for spreading real-time critical information about fast-moving events is something that we don't want to lose. So it is, and also as information management professionals, we don't want to be in the business of censoring information. We like to have free flow of information. This documenting the historic moment that we're in, I think the misinformation is just as important a source of documentation of that as other kinds of information. So it does make our job more challenging. It's also highly contingent. I mean, one person's rolled gold information might be another person's fake news. And there's not necessarily a set of absolute criteria that can be brought to bear on putting information into categories of being trustworthy or untrustworthy. It can be very contingent. So, so given all of those issues, I'd like to hear from the panelists about their thoughts on how should IAM professionals respond to these complex challenges? What role can they play in minimising the dangers of misinformation in the sorts of critical situations that we've been experiencing? David.
Okay, no, thanks, Adrian. Yeah, look, you know, for me, it really is. It's making sure that the records are being kept, you know, like being as far upstream as possible, to make sure that we are capturing the information that needs to be captured, not sort of just the loudest voices, you know, and this is where information creeps in. And unfortunately, some of the misinformation comes from the most senior people in, you know, public administration around the world, which is a bit sad. And I'm sure Timothy, you'll have something to say about that, I've got no doubt. But, you know, for me, it's because I think what sets information management professionals apart at times like this is, while so many of us are, as I said earlier, caught up in the moment, everybody involved in IAM really has to be looking to the future. You know, you're always thinking about what comes next. And that's what sets that profession apart, I think. That's where this idea of appraisal and of understanding the value, long-term strategic value of information really sets this profession apart. And so for me, it's all of the IAM professionals, you know, whatever organisation you're in, to really think, well, what is the role that we're serving at the moment? What are we doing right now? If I'm working in the health sector, in the foreign policy sector, if I'm working in as a first responder sector, to really understand that role that is being performed, and then to sort of have a professional assessment of, okay, what is the critical evidence that needs to be captured here that will document this, to provide that evidentiary trail of what we're doing now. And so it's thinking outside of the moment, it's thinking outside of tomorrow morning's headline, or beyond tomorrow morning's headline, really thinking about that long view of the future. And it is a profession, you know, it requires a very strong business analysis skill, some political nous, a bit of understanding about history, you know, to really understand, you know, okay, what we're doing right now, it's important for us to capture this particular information. And then what we then need to do as information management professionals is to say, well, where is that information? You know, what platform is that being captured on? Because it won't necessarily be put into the records management system. It might be in an email, it could be a Zoom conference that's being recorded, it could be social media, it could be a WhatsApp, you know, whatever it is. And so, you know, as IAM professionals, we need to know where it is, and then we need to have a strategy to bring that in, to memorize it properly. And then finally, I'd say that as a professional, you've then got to make that easy, you know, you can't then impose this framework and structure and set of processes which are just impossible for people to manage while they're caught up in the cut and thrust of everyday work. So it's a lot, you know, it's a heavy responsibility, but we have to find ways to make it as easy and as natural as possible to see that information captured and preserved, and to be ready to identify that 10%, you know, which is important, and just let go of the other 90% as being of short-term or low value. And I think they're the sort of things. And, you know, the archives, we've been, you know, pushing that information out, those sort of guidelines and advice across the Commonwealth Public Service. And I think that's the responsibility of all of us in this information management profession at the moment, is to make sure that that does happen.
Thank you, David. Actually, can I just throw in a quick sort of addendum to my earlier question? And it's picking up on something you've mentioned in both your answers, and that is, you know, everyone's aware that we're living through extraordinary times. Do you, or have you found, and I'd be interested in Elizabeth's views and the views of the other panellists on this as well, but have you found an increasing receptiveness amongst your target audiences, the public officials in your case, to good information management messages? Have you found an increasing respect for the work of IAM professionals, or is it the case that we've kind of been sidelined and the world's moving on and our messages are falling on deaf ears?
Look, there's been a bit of positive response from the Chief Medical Officer in particular, and the Deputy Chief Medical Officer. Both of them have been saying to the meetings of public servants that at times like this, you know, data is everything. You know, they need to move very quickly and make good decisions. And so they, at the very peak of those bodies now, and going into the National Cabinet and those other organs of government at the moment, they've been very clear about that, you know, don't come into that discussion unless you've got the information, quality, reliable information at your fingertips, because we need to make a decision. If that information is 10 minutes late, it's useless. You know, if the information is 10% wrong, it's useless. And so that is flowing back, Adrian, through I think the Commonwealth Public Service, that we'd better get this right. Because, you know, everyone's known data is king, but at times like this, it's, you know, data writ large. It's about policy formulation, policy outcomes, have all of the scenarios been properly documented, brought to bear, etc. Now, no one's got time to write long documents, so it's not that sort of record keeping where we all spend time doing, you know, whatever it is, you know, whether it's a PowerPoint presentation, whether it's you know, a short message, but it's got to be right, and you've got to know where it is, and you've got to be able to bring it together. So that is one area where I think the power of information is coming to much more to the forefront of a you know, public administration and the way people think about good governance and good public administration.
Great, thank you. Elizabeth, what's your take on that?
Checking that I'm no longer on mute. So I'm going to be very brief in my response because David has picked up some of the key issues in terms of preservation and assurance. I'll just augment that, those principles by way of looking at the downstream. We're very much in the immediate right now, but ultimately information allows individuals to assert their rights, and that's part of democracy. So downstream, that assertion of rights is only ever founded upon good information. Now, the contemporary challenges that we face, those three major changes, give rise to, I think, some new questions for information management professionals. And they go to the way in which information is held, how it's stored, how it's captured, how it's managed, how it's applied. So the first question for me is, who holds the information? Is it held by way of a contractual relationship, and is it outsourced from government? If so, how does government or the contracting entity actually manage the risks associated with that outsourcing of information? How do they manage reputational risks? How do they manage accuracy risks? So there's a whole set of questions around who holds the information. The second issue is, in what form is it held? Is it a database? Can it be accessed? Can it be reproduced, combined? Is it an output from an algorithm? In which case, what were the inputs? What's the source code? If it's machine learning, how is it constantly assessed in terms of accuracy? Is it achieving the objectives? And then the third question is, how will access be provided? The important point I want to make here is access is actually about explainability. Think lawyers explaining rights in the past. Do we need data scientists to explain how an algorithm is delivering or informing a government decision or a decision of any other enterprise? So now, looking at explainability, how do we consider the checks and balances that are required? Do we know the source code? Will it be publicly provided? Do we keep audit records? Do we undertake regular audit logs? And do we constantly reassess that that algorithm is delivering to the objective that we set? I want to take David's point too. I think there is a real opportunity here to leverage the notion of transparency, accuracy, and accessibility. We're seeing proactive release of information. Never before, in my view, have we seen such proactive release of information from in relation to health data and many other forms of data. And that can be a really unique opportunity for information management professionals. And I think we need to absolutely exploit that opportunity.
Excellent. Thanks, Elizabeth. Tim, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll try and be brief here. I think just picking up on the points that Elizabeth and David have made. I mean, for me, one of the biggest proactive tasks that we could do at the moment is to look at the notion of misinformation management. So too often we're sort of beset by a torrent of content to which we do not know where it came from, to what extent it's valid or reliable, to what extent it's factual. And there's this kind of messy game that occurs where, for example, during the Australian bushfires, there was more or less a polarised Australian public around the origin or the sources of the bushfires. And that, broadly speaking, the two camps were around arson as the cause, and then climate change as being the cause. And again, one of the problems that we had was that we're suddenly beset by all of this content, all of this information flying around, but too often we don't have access to, or we forget genealogy of where it comes from. And I think perhaps there's a key role for information management professionals to be systematically archiving the public discussions that are happening around these kinds of polarizing, contentious issues, so that when it comes to the point where, for example, we have what would otherwise be a fringe group of accounts on Twitter or on Facebook who are pushing a particular narrative. You know, maybe they're pushing the notion that arson is the cause of the bushfires. This has policy implications. It has implications for democracy and for fact checking. If we're able to know that this is where it came from, rather than thinking, oh, hey, half of the Australian population believe this, being able to establish that by relying on principled, rigorous archiving, which is not happening in terms of misinformation, and probably for good reason at the moment. I think that this is a great opportunity to be able to resolve and mitigate some of the issues that we're seeing when suddenly everyone, including people like Donald Trump, are touting, conspiracy theories and things like that. And we think, well, how did we get to this situation? And everyone acts so quickly, and it's just this kind of 24-hour news cycle. But going back historically, going back through the archives, saying this is where it came from. This is the history of this idea. I think that that's a really untapped and potentially very beneficial thing that information management professionals could look towards.
Excellent. Thanks, Tim. Kathryn.
I'll be very brief. I think everyone has raised really good points about examining critical evidence. And we need to do that in our own practice. So I know with Blue Shield, responding to situations, people would say, oh, people need this, or this is happening here. Actually, we needed to critically assess where's that coming from, what do they really need, who's the best point of coordination. So there's a lot of willingness to want to help. Let's keep records of what's happening. Let's actually examine what's happening with that critical mindset as we go. So it's very much, you know, we can suffer as much from unintentional, well-meaning misinformation in a crisis situation as anyone else. And so let's be aware of that too.
Okay, well, look, I've exceeded my time, so it's now time for me to hand the baton over to my fellow moderator, Dave Williams. So, Dave, over to you for the rest of the proceedings.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian. And I've got a number of questions that are flowing through in for the participants. And so I'm going to pick some of them off and challenge them with it. So while we're doing that, there should be a poll that's just been released for you, which was about quite timely, as there's been a lot of questions online for it, about what's your position on using the COVID Safe app. But I'll start with you first, David Fricker. And there was an interesting question that came through from Barbara, which was actually the first question, and it made me curious too. I mean, there's really strong and clear rules around record keeping for decisions in Cabinet, but what about National Cabinet?
No, I think that's it's a new function of government. It's a new sort of form of our cooperative federalism that we're seeing emerging as a result of this pandemic, which I think generally people agreeing is a positive development. And it is a hot issue. This issue. It's all of the records authorities, archives, and public records officers of all the jurisdictions of Australia and New Zealand do get together periodically, and Adrian would be very well aware of this. CARA, it is the Council on Australasian Archives and Records Authorities, and this is a topic that we've been discussing to make sure that the records of the National Cabinet are properly maintained, and the jurisdictional sovereignty, if you like, over those records are also being properly recognised. Because every member of that National Cabinet has got a stake and ownership of the National Cabinet. Although, as I understand it, and I confess my investigations are still going on around the National Cabinet, but I understand it was constituted as a subcommittee of the Federal Cabinet, and so we're just going to sort of sort through whose records they are and to make sure that the sovereignty of each jurisdiction is preserved and maintained. But the good news is it's a great question because it's a hot topic of discussion across the CARA right now.
All right, thank you, Dave. So, Kathryn, Elizabeth brought up an interesting point about the data that we get actually from the Worldometer site, which is really interesting and scary to see. And it goes into great detail about exactly how many deaths and how many people have contracted the disease worldwide. But can we actually sort of trust this data, do you think? I mean, what's your view on how various different countries have approached this in their data? Kathryn.
Oh, sorry. Yes, so it's an interesting question. I guess it goes back to actually what David or Adrian were both saying about provenance and transparency. So it's asking those same questions that information management people do all the time. Who created it? When was it created? How was it created? I think they're the guiding points to assessing that sort of accuracy. But I guess Tim might also have some comment on that one.
Yeah, Tim, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, some of this points towards deep philosophical questions about the nature of knowledge. And I think that the bushfire emergency really kind of catapulted us into very fundamental questions about the role of scientific expertise and authority, and the relationship between politics and scientific authority. And I think it becomes difficult for information managers to be able to ascertain the factuality of individual points of data when they are so highly contentious at the intersection between the political and science. So, you know, a point in case would be, I mean, you could pick any number of examples, but again, the climate change issue, I won't call it a debate necessarily, but it is an issue. I think this is a very tricky role for information managers, because often scientific consensus on a particular issue does not reflect the policy positions that are taken by many different governments around the world. So it becomes very tricky to advocate and you know, to provide reliable and trustworthy expertise about this matter, because we cannot really get to the truth of the matter when there is this kind of contentious political context around things. I'm not sure. I think probably this just generates 10 or 20 more questions rather than actually provides any clarification. But I suppose in my experience, there's the experiential knowledge, and I think that politicians and policymakers often draw on this much more than they would explicate. You know, I think that this plays a large role in the facts that we see, circulating in the news and in public discourse. So somewhere between you know, the Uncle Arthurs of the world who may have a role to play in politics, and scientists who painstakingly work through rigorous models and try to report back what they see. Somewhere in the middle there is a messy space that there really is no key answers at the moment, but I guess that space is something that I'm interested in, and I think perhaps many of the other panelists and participants here are as well.
Yep, yeah, good point. So Elizabeth, got a number of questions for you, so I have to cherry pick them and that. But one of the interesting one is, it seems that, do you think that governments don't necessarily think that some of the population can handle the truth about what's going on, and there sort of seems to be a bit of reticence in actually revealing all the warts and all about where we are or what's happening, or even down to things like source code in the COVID app?
Yeah, that issue manifests in many ways in the current crisis. One that I think highlights both that balance. I've been watching the questions, and there's a lot there around privacy as well. So if I draw upon some of the American experience to answer that question, it probably transcends a number of examples. So in America, I don't know if many of you have been watching, but The Guardian and other reputable publishers have been calling on greater data because of the inequity of the manifestation and harm caused by COVID in a pretty much polarised society. So 25% of the deaths from COVID-19 in America are Afro-Americans, but they only represent 13% of the population. Likewise, in Chicago, 30% of the population are black, but they represent 70% of the known COVID cases and 50% of deaths. Now, this is where we start to get into, can you handle the truth, and then also the notion of privacy. The next step is why. Why are Afro-Americans being harmed in such greater proportions? And some early work is starting to deliver some answers. So, for example, and this becomes increasingly private information, although de-identified and aggregated. So, in recent polls, only 20% of Afro-Americans have been offered the opportunity to work from home. Now, their white counterparts represent a 30% opportunity offered to work from home. Likewise, even more personal still, underlying health disorders. COVID attacks the cardiopulmonary system, especially has very detrimental effects on those who might suffer from underlying health disorders such as diabetes. If we look at the personal health profile of Afro-Americans, it is more compromised than that of the white counterparts. So knowing the truth, understanding the truth, is actually what is going to help us in this immediate crisis, in our response to the crisis, and also in rebuilding a future. So the accuracy of this data, the sharing of this data, the importance of framing the data to inform positive public outcomes could not be more vital.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. And in that, in the light of actually sharing the data, I'll ask Vlad to actually share the results of the poll that we had out there. So we can see that on the screen now. And how many, 5% are an advocate, and I would put myself in that. I'll put for my bias. 36% of information management people are undecided. That's interesting to see from within the profession itself, that level of undecision, and understandably, and it's, I don't know, David Fricker, do you think that that's probably reflective of the general population?
Actually, I'm a bit surprised by that. I have to say, it's you know, I think there are lots of questions, and Elizabeth, you went to this very early in our discussion this morning about the privacy. You know, privacy is such a major concern for all Australians and much of the world. And Elizabeth, you made some really good points about, you know, the balance between maintaining privacy, but also with an eye to that the collective good. I think you refer to it as that collective security, and what Australians are prepared to do to achieve the balance between, you know, what they see to their personal privacy and the collective security of Australia. I think we do need to do a bit more about discussing the privacy measures that are in place. At the archives, we did post some information on our website just to make it absolutely clear about the preservation of the algorithm, which is, Elizabeth, again, you've already mentioned. I think that's really important. But our messaging was about the private and personal data will be destroyed by law after the pandemic is over. And, you know, so I think we need to do better messaging as public officials about our treatment of privacy and how the privacy frameworks work, but also to upsell the benefits in terms of collective security. So a bit surprised by the survey results, but nonetheless, I think it's a good survey to run. I think it's something that we need to keep thinking about. Yeah, definitely worthy of a good discussion on that. But I'm going to try and spread around the questions and look at some different perspectives on it. And a number of questions, Kathryn, have been coming up about what is the future for information professionals, you know, going to present us with? You know, how are we going to operate differently in the future? You know, is there now a more important role for us in that, and how are we actually going to do our business differently, and the sort of services we provide?
Yeah, and I can see something there about, particularly about Blue Shield, and how, yes, we have past experience in responding to kind of emergency incidents and so on, not being the first responders, but coordinating resources and those sorts of things. But, you know, the world has changed and things are different. It's not a localised incident. It is very broad. You know, how do we look at the breadth of disease or refugees or climate change? And, you know, challenging how are we looking at that? And I think it's a really, really good point that we actually have to kind of shift our thinking and the way that we do sort of future forecasting and future planning. And another organisation involved in this area, AICCM, which is Professional Association for Conservators, have done some really good work about, you know, what is the future forecasting and how does it impact on what we do. And I think the change that comes is that we're not thinking just about material as much, or we're not focusing on material, but more on people who've always been primary, but people and services. So a lot of these current crisis situations actually don't just threaten, as a bushfire or flood, the collection material or the archives or the records themselves, but how we provide a service. You know, we are here in an online panel. I'm sure everybody is spending much more time, you know, on a screen, and it's thinking about actually reshaping those sorts of things. And then having done that, what does that impact on the way that we manage information, the way that we make it available? My day job is at the Australian National University. We're a large collecting archives. We can't get access to the collection at the moment, so we're delivering online services. And some of that we can still continue to do because we've digitised, but there's a lot that, you know, we have to think, well, you know, how do we do this differently? What are the other services that we need to be providing? So it's that kind of thinking. I think it's a really good point. And here is a good moment again to be looking at this and reflecting on it.
Yep. So Tim, just to finish up, are information management professionals the new social influencers?
I love that idea, Dave. You know, I think that's true. There's a very sexy role for information managers, but a very critical role. And I just going back to the poll, I think for a moment, and some of the comments and that Elizabeth had made, you know, it doesn't surprise me so much that so many people are undecided about this app. You know, we see that there's hoaxes going around that are trying to disinform the public about what's going on. For example, there was a message going around that appeared that was going around social media that appeared to show that the government was using the app to track your geolocation. So if you went more than 20 kilometers from your house, then you would, you know, you have to call the government. I mean, that's what the hoax was saying. And the Australian Federal Police are kind of trying to crack down on that. And this is one of like maybe, you know, 10 or 12 hoaxes and pieces of really damaging pieces of misinformation that are going to railroad the ability of the government to roll this out and to save lives potentially. Then I think that there's a very influential role for information managers to weigh in on this and, you know, perhaps to work directly with platforms and with government to track this stuff, to crack down on it before it becomes out of control, before people either become so cognitively overloaded with information and misinformation that they can't make a decision about using it, or become polarized, you know, and say, no way, I'm not letting the government look at where you know, they're not going to track me, which is just patently false.
Right.
So
I'm going to cut you off there, Tim, because I've got to keep to time. But thank you for that. I mean, it's such a broad expanse of topics that we could go for a couple of days. So I'll just finish up by saying thank you, Tim, Kathryn, Elizabeth, and David, for your time today. It's been terrific to sort of just scratch the surface of this. And I'll finish up by just handing over to Dave Fricker to actually launch Information Awareness Month. David.
Oops. Yep. No, thank you, David. Yes, and I'll also be brief here. Look, this event that you just hosted is speaks for itself in terms of opening Information Awareness Month. It is the issue of information as a national resource, as a fundamental part of Australia, as a knowledge society, as a part of Australia's continuing evolution of as just and inclusive society. Just cannot be overstated. And I think Information Awareness Month is a great opportunity to bring professional associations and institutions together just so that we can sort of rally around and just re-examine what we're all doing, to share best practice, to share our knowledge, and to energise ourselves as a community to keep that momentum going, but also to spread the word, you know, to have some influence and shape the rest of Australian society about the importance of good information management as a way to enhance the integrity of public administration across Australia and to make Australia ultimately a more just and more inclusive and more prosperous society. I think these things are very important. I think information is the new resource for our cultural and economic prosperity. So look, I really am very, very grateful to IAM for running this event today. Thank you for everyone that organised it. And it gives me great pleasure to declare Information Awareness Month officially open. Thank you.
Yep, thank you, Dave. And I'll hand back to Vlad now.
Thank you, Dave. I'll start with thanking David Frickett for declaring yet another Information Awareness Month open. Thank you for that. And my thanks also go to, I hope that you all will join thanking me to our panelists today. That you have on the screen. Additionally, my thanks go to our moderators that did a fantastic job in making this a smooth webinar with so many questions and so many good answers. Also, my thanks to all the participants that joined us today and took part in our voting and asking questions. We're going to do our best to answer all the questions that you have asked and publish them with recordings of this session in coming days. Also, I would like to thank all the organizations that helped make Information Awareness Month 2020 possible. And lastly, on the screen now you see a snapshot of the Information Awareness Month 2020 calendar. So there's plenty of interesting events. Please visit our website that is listed in your invitations for the details about other events and to register to be part of them. Thank you all again. Stay safe, healthy, and well informed. I look forward to seeing you at one of the next events. Have a good day. Thank you all.